Are we ready to go, Caitlin?
Yes, all good.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you to all for tearing yourselves away for a while from the unfolding drama in Whitehall. My name is Vanessa Glynn, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in the European Movement in Scotland series of webinars on EU topics. This one is asking whether we should rejoin the single market and customs union. The UK left the EU in January last year and left the single market and customs union at the start of 2021. Since then, people across the UK are noticing shortages of labour, with hospitality, logistics, food and drink, and care services particularly hit. There's a scarcity of products, friction at our borders for both goods and people, and a mountain of red tape. Trade with the EU has fallen dramatically. The economy is showing losses, with businesses suffering, especially small businesses, and a number of companies moving location into the European Union. And not least, there are worrying tensions connected to the Northern Ireland Protocol. EMiS campaigns to rejoin the European Union as a full member, either as part of the UK or, if the electorate so decide, as an independent Scotland. But could another, perhaps quicker and easier, option be reintegration with the single market and customs union? After the EU referendum, this option was discussed and championed by some as a soft Brexit solution. That would mean remaining in the trade and economic area with the advantages of the four freedoms, but out of the political structures. It was quickly dismissed by Prime Minister May and was anathema to Johnson and the hard Brexiteers. But would opinion across the UK be more favourable to closer integration now that we see the reality of Brexit and its economic and social dislocation? While the polls show people thinking Brexit is not going well, and an early rejoining of the EU does seem unlikely. But is there a case for revisiting rejoining the single market and the customs union? And in what circumstances? We have a distinguished panel with us today, and we will hear from each of our speakers in turn before wider discussion and questions generated from you, our audience. Please, can I ask you to use the Q&A function if you would like to put a question. Please only use the chat if you want to comment on the discussion or share your views in some other way. Our panel consists of Dr. Philippa Whitford, David Broucher, and Peter Sellar. Philippa is the Member of Parliament for Central Ayrshire. Originally from Belfast, Philippa trained mostly around the west of Scotland. She spent 2 years working as a medical volunteer in the Middle East, including in Gaza and the Lebanon. She was a consultant breast surgeon for over 15 years in Ayrshire and Arran, as well as lead clinician for that health board and for the west of Scotland. Philippa is the shadow SNP Westminster Group leader for health and spokesperson on Europe. David was a British diplomat for nearly 40 years. He spent most of his career in Europe and became ambassador to the Czech Republic in 1997. After retirement, he worked with the governments of Romania and Croatia on their accession to the EU. Born in Cardiff, David identifies as Welsh, British, and European. In, he says, no particular order. Peter is a lawyer, a member of the Brussels Bar, and an advocate, although non-practicing at the moment, in Scotland. He is the EU regulatory partner at Fieldfisher, Brussels. Fieldfisher is a major multinational law firm with expertise across a range of professional services and EU legal fields. He is also author of a paper on the Single Market and Customs Union for the cross-party Scottish Independence Convention. And it's to Peter that we will go first, and he will screen share his presentation with us.
I'm just about to do that. I hope that I've managed to do that.
Yes.
Can you confirm, Vanessa? Thank you very much.
Yes, that's fine.
Well, good evening or good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much, Vanessa, for the invitation and the introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to present on this issue, which is of professional and personal interest to me. It always has been, probably always will be. I'm going to be talking, this is a grand title, what could our European future hold? I'm going to be a little bit more nuanced about that in the time that we have to discuss this. And I'm also going to avoid, for now, I mean, it may come up in discussion, the question of whether or not we're talking about Scotland as an independent nation or Scotland as a sub-state or some other arrangement whereby we get into the customs union and or the single market. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sketch out what are the principal options, the main options, not the reverse Greenland or the Monaco or the Faroe Isles or the Hong Kong arrangement, which I'm happy to elaborate on later on. It was one of my joke ones, but who knows, it could have had a go early days. And I'm also not going to talk about the cake and eat it arrangements that we sought early doors, or things from a Scottish perspective, currying favour, saying, well, they have sympathy with us in the EU, therefore they're going to surely bend over backwards for us. I'm going to try and just look at the three main options that we have in an objective fashion, and then conclude as to whether one or t'other is more reasonable or more realistic. And those options are in sort of increasing order of challenge. You start with EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. Second one is the EEA, so the European Economic Agreement and Area, through EFTA. So you have to actually be, Scotland would have to become part of EFTA to join the EEA. The alternative being that third option, the EU, being part of the EU as a member state, 28th member state, and which means that you have to become part of the EEA. That's a treaty requirement. So I'll take it in each in turn. Just looking at EFTA. So EFTA is a pure intergovernmental arrangement. It's an agreement between four countries, Liechtenstein, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. It's been around since the early 60s, 1960. We were part of it. EFTA has known more departures than anyone joining. In actual fact, I don't think anyone's actually joined EFTA. People should look at EFTA, the agreement that underpins the association, as being a sort of a classic free trade agreement. It has a little bit more to it than that, but it really is just a free trade agreement allowing for the free movement of goods to a greater or lesser extent, most goods, not all goods, of some services, but not financial services, and of some types of people, so those who are economically active, so not all people. There is no political desire or political integration, and that's underpinned by the fact that there are no EU-like or EFTA-like supranational institutions. I put that down as a neutral point because I don't know if people like having supranational authorities, but there's nothing which overhangs or overlooks the operation of this agreement other than simply the four countries sit down to make sure that it works as smoothly as possible. What it definitely doesn't do is it doesn't keep us within a customs union. So there is no customs union, which is great from one perspective. It means that we, Scotland or the UK or whomever, would be free to arrange its trading arrangements with whomever. It could be the United States, could be with other countries, could be with the EU. The other positive is also that when you join EFTA, you have to join 29 free trade agreements that have already been signed and negotiated with 29 arrangements, but with covering 40 countries. And they're not insignificant countries. They include the likes of Mexico and Singapore. So what you have with EFTA, if you join, is an arrangement. You'd be the fifth country alongside the four that's at the top there, plus also you'd have a free trade arrangements with 40 other countries around the world. But if there is one massive downside, is that it doesn't actually provide any immediate relationship with the EU, trading or otherwise. So it doesn't bring that to the table. That said, it's a relatively painless exercise to actually become a member of EFTA. He says painless. I haven't seen a precedent. That said, because it is a standard type free trade arrangement, and the procedures are actually extremely light touch in terms of the law doesn't say much about it, then it would be expected that the only thing that could stop it is the politics, and I would be surprised if the politics got in the way. So EFTA is the low-hanging fruit ambition of the European future. The next one up is the EEA, so this European Economic Agreement covering the EU 27 and the EFTA 3, not Switzerland. Switzerland has its own bilateral arrangements with the EU. The focus of the EEA is effectively to take whatever economic arrangements and trading arrangements you have in EFTA and to soup it up, but not to the level of the EU. So if there is a focus, it's on economic integration and not on ever closer union or necessarily sharing of values, etc. And the positive is that one would benefit from the 4 freedoms, the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and persons. And it means that we would have a privileged status, privileged vis-a-vis the rest of the world, status within the single market, because a product that's made in Scotland or in Norway is going to be deemed to be the same as a product made in France or Malta, and it can move around, likewise a student, etc. So we have a lot of the positives that we have lost as a result of Brexit, we would have back if we were to be allowed back into the EEA. But there are significant carve-outs. So you're in the EEA, but you're not part of a customs union. You're not part of the common fisheries policy, the common foreign security policy, the common agricultural policy. You don't have to commit to joining the euro and the eurozone, and you don't have to be part of the Schengen agreement, so the borders, etc. Although Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein are part of Schengen. But because you're outside of the customs union, it means that you, in this case, Scotland, would have a flexible arrangement with regard to third countries, such as the rest of the United Kingdom. So the EEA, despite us being in the single market, because we're outside the customs union, we have a certain flexibility there. It becomes a little bit complicated because the downside to the flexibility is that second point under negatives, which is that you have rules of origin questions. So at the border right now between the EEA and the EU, the most obvious one geographically is Norway and Sweden, there are border posts, for want of a better word, or at least there's some technology and there's some people who will do spot checks to make sure that to make sure that the origin of the product is Norway and not China. I won't go into the details of that, but suffice to say there is a border which will have an effect on trade flows. The other huge disadvantage, if this is what annoys people, is this undermining of political sovereignty, if I can put it that way, which is quite fiery language in a way, is this democratic deficit. So being part of the single market sounds great, except the laws that tell you what's in your cosmetic product or what's in your car and your engine or your iPhone or whatever it is that you're making, those laws are going to be adopted by people who are not your representatives. You will not have a Scottish MEP or a Scottish commissioner, and you won't have an express right to vote. What you will have is on the sidelines influence, because you do have a representation on committees, but you have that express democratic deficit, which is why they call it, or they used to call it, democracy by fax. You stand by the fax machine and wait for the law to come in, and then basically you would then have to adopt it as part of EEA law. So you have that balance of, you have access, you're part of the single market, with some of the little carve-outs there, which are probably positive for Scotland, who knows. But the downside is the democratic deficit. And also you need to have some sort of a border. Neutral, I've put underneath there the fact that you have to make an annual payment. And these are the grants that you are quite targeted grants. You can choose how you make your payments, but you still have to make an annual payment. And you do have supranational bodies. So you have the EFTA Surveillance Authority, which is a little bit like the European Commission, but not quite as strong. So for instance, it doesn't have any right of monopoly to propose laws. And you also have the EFTA courts, which again is a little bit of a baby version or softer version of the European court, because it issues advisory judgments, but nevertheless, you have these supranational institutions in which Scotland, if it were to be part of the EEA through EFTA, it would have representation in the EFTA court and in the authority. I'll move on to the next one, which is the one that we know and that we've lost, which is the EU, be 27 plus 1, maybe some others, because we're not the only one who's trying to accede to the EU. I think I won't go into the detail of this at all, because it should be something that people will understand, because we had this up until effectively last year. The positives are you have full 4 freedoms, all of the freedoms, and of course we also have, because it's part of the law, we would have that extra relationship with the EFTA 3. We would have full participation in the democratic structures. And I say full because while up until last year we were part of the UK, I'm sure maybe Philippa, certainly others can speak to the fact that Scotland's voice wasn't necessarily made as loud as it could have been. Here, Scotland would have its own voice, it would have its own set of MEPs, its own commissioner, etc. And in the build-up to getting into the EU, if that is what is wanted, there tends to be, meaning that there always is, an accession, a pre-accession association agreement. And I mention this because they are asymmetric, so they tend to be set up to be to the benefit of the country that's trying to accede to the EU, is to try and get them, is to their benefit, financial benefit, but also there will be other mechanisms which the EU has at its disposal to assist the acceding country to get its institutional infrastructure in place, for example. And that's a point that I make in the negative. If we're going to join the EU, we need to be set up institutionally. We need to have some real substantive changes. Institutionally, I mean by that, for instance, if you're going to have competition law applied here in Scotland, well, you need to have a competition law body doing that. We don't have that because it's down in London. If you're going to apply your REACH chemicals regulation, well, you need to have a health and safety executive up here in Scotland, which is competent to do that. You also, when you have to commit to the euro, you need to have a central bank. The other negative is that you would be automatically, well, not automatically, there's a legal commitment to being part of Schengen, though I'll get to that in the next slide, which is the last slide. The other neutral thing will be in the CFP. So the fisheries policy will be in the agricultural policy. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'll leave it to others to judge. Picking on these are some of the political points and challenges that one has with regard to the European Union and acceding to it. And I'll just go through them rather quickly. People question whether or not Spain, for instance, would exercise a veto. I think that's a relevant question, but it's receding. For as long as Scotland does so, goes through the process in a democratic fashion and in a legitimate fashion, whatever that means, then there will be no objections. There really cannot be objections, not least because I think arguably the treaty would prevent those objections being entertained. The same would say in terms of vetoes. Spain technically could try to veto Scotland acceding to the EEA. So it's a live question there as well, but it's obviously less of a threatening one from their perspective. Schengen, I mentioned that that's a legal requirement if you join the EU, but Ireland is a good example of a country or a member state that's not part of Schengen, albeit they negotiated that while being a member state. That would be the difference. But the reason why Scotland could or should be able to piggyback on that is because of the pre-existing common travel area that existed before the EEC. In which case it would be rather anomalous if Scotland were forced into Schengen. The deficit is always the big question. Croatia joined with a deficit higher than the 3% of GDP that's allowed under the Stability and Growth Pact. And frankly, there's not one member state that has ever actually complied fully with the Stability and Growth Pact. Every single member state has had a problem. I would also add that even today, I think the finance minister, the new finance minister in Germany, has mentioned that they're going to be looking at the deficit, apart from anything else, and also whether or not the Stability and Growth Pact needs to be applied quite as strictly as it has been. With regard to the currency, again, maybe there's a question about whether or not Scotland needs to have launched its own currency and its central bank, etc. Well, it needs to have the institutions, and it needs to be able to show that it has the ability to control its monetary policy and its economy. But Montenegro is in the race for accession. It does not have its own currency. It currently uses the euro, and there's absolutely no indication that it will be required to adopt or to set up its own currency before accession. So there are cases where the unique circumstances of each country will be taken into account. Trade, obviously, people will say, but we trade in Scotland more with the rest of the UK. Is it really in our interest? That's for others to discuss and conclude on. What, on the other hand, we have seen is that with the Northern Ireland being in that very particular and very beneficial and advantageous position under its protocol, there has been, I think this is probably politically dynamite for some, but there has been a diversion of trade or an adaptation to regulatory circumstances. And apart from that, you can look at Ireland as well. Ireland now has many more ferry routes to continental Europe than it's ever had before. So, and that's been done incredibly quickly. So the question for me of trade is, fine, there may be a hit, but it's called adaptation. All businesses know how to adapt. The last one I'll mention here is the acquis communautaire, which is the body of European law that we have to have in place before we can accede. We need to be able to apply it and have it enforced. That's the reference to institution building. I also mentioned that before. But the more that we diverge away from the European law, which is the whole point of Brexit. The whole point of Brexit is the ability to go our own, to chart our own path, our own regulatory path. But the more that happens, then the more that we have to unravel and undo. And that adds another layer of bureaucracy, but also challenge. And you can see, I can already see in the work that I do on a daily basis, there are differences. There are huge differences. And indeed, even today, the REACH regulation on chemicals, there's apparently going to be a massive difference down the line. I'll have to advise some clients about that in due course. So that is, and I mentioned the UK Internal Market Act because that has a dynamic there, which means that we're likely to be brought, if we're Scottish, to be brought further away from the EU acquis than we would probably like. That is my last slide, and that is, I've presented what I wanted to present on. Obviously, I've missed out other things such as the actual procedures involved in getting into these arrangements, these associations. It's pretty obvious that EFTA is quite easy, EEA is a little bit more tricky, and of course the EU is the one which is the heftiest and takes the greatest amount of time. And no doubt people say, well, how long do we all think it would take Scotland, for instance, as an independent state or as a sub-state of something else to get in? Well, maybe I'll just leave that and see what people say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Thank you for that very clear and helpful scene setter, raising a number of key issues that we'll be able to go on and discuss as we continue. Let's now please go to Philippa for her take. I understand Scottish Government policy is full membership of the EU, but do you think could single market, customs union membership be something your party or the Scottish Government would consider, as it indeed did in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote? Thank you.
I think it's important to recognise where we are now and where an independent Scotland, which clearly I believe in as a Scottish National Party MP and indeed activist from the first referendum, I clearly believe in that. So some of the measures that we might have voted for here at Westminster as, less than the worst, if you like, are not necessarily things that you would aspire to be putting a lot of effort into. So obviously the title of this was looking at rejoining the single market and customs union. And to me, that rules out EFTA on its own, because that is neither the single market nor the customs union. And really what most people mean is they mean EFTA EEA. So they mean Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, who are EFTA members, who are in the EEA, but are not in the EU. And Peter obviously has laid a lot of things out very clearly, really, about what could contribute to the pluses and minuses of that. So people imply that it's going to be easier, quicker, and cheaper to join the EEA and get single market access. Now, it's not necessarily going to be easier, because for you to become an EEA member, all the other EEA members have to agree. So, if you're casting up things like a Spanish veto or whatever else, some of that would still apply. Obviously, what you're joining is less complex than the EU, but the EU, as Peter highlighted, has an accession process which you follow. And in actual fact, and we have Croatia and their journey in, which sets an example ahead of us of how much, once the EU has decided they are open to new members, they are actually trying to help you join. They're not actually trying to be bloody minded. With regards to the EEA, yes, you're in the single market. You get access to quite a lot of the agencies and programs, but not the kind of justice things like European arrest warrant, Eurojust, Europol. And to me, some of these things are actually quite important when we've looked at some of the issues that we face down here. You have to pay for the agencies that you're part of, and you have to contribute to the cohesion funds. And as Peter said, to me, the biggest thing that is against the EEA on its own is the democratic deficit. We moan all the time about, you know, Westminster and the fact that we're so utterly outvoted. Brexit has demonstrated that it doesn't matter tuppence how people in Scotland vote. We voted against Brexit, we got Brexit. In elections, we vote against Conservative, and we got Boris Johnson. So, you know, a lot of what people are not happy with is the democratic deficit of the union as it is. So to me, the idea of going into a situation where we do have, as they say, government by facts, you may get some conversations on the edge, but you are basically taking the rules, is quite a negative thing. And you would still be outside the customs union. So there would be border friction, particularly where we've seen the big hits at the moment is for processed fish, fresh fish, farming produce, processed goods around food where you need export health certificates. You are basically maybe paying tariffs, as Norway does, on things like smoked salmon, which always gave Scottish smoked salmon a huge advantage. And those tariffs can be quite significant, up into the teens. You also have, as Peter referred to, rules of origin. That's already impacting on businesses in my constituency who import components from indeed all over the world, sometimes from Europe, to then make a product to send back as a completed product to Europe. That still includes rules of origin tariffs, which are then making it unviable, and they're actually having to move, pardon me, parts of their businesses to Europe. One of the things I would say we've experienced, not so much myself directly, but some of my colleagues who have had discussions with representatives from Norway, Iceland, not so much Liechtenstein, is they don't want us to see EFTA EEA as a temporary measure. For us to be welcomed by them into the group of 4 or the group of 3, they would be wanting us to see it as a destination, as a choice, not a temporary parking place. So the idea that those countries are going to accept us in, and then a couple of years later, we'll just move on, that is something that categorically they would not welcome. And if they had the sense that that's what Scotland and independent Scotland was trying to do, then, you know, you might actually meet a little bit more resistance. Obviously, the title was, should Scotland or the UK look to rejoin the single market and customs union? And obviously the UK-wide European movement is looking to try to build support for that. I can tell you, sitting in this parliament at the moment, that is not something that is coming anytime soon. I would say the views here are more extreme. Obviously, whenever the next election is, whether it's in 23 or 24, you know, we don't know exactly how government might change. But you have to also remember, Labour has changed its position, and its position is to accept Brexit, somehow make it work, which, you know, to me is a bit of an oxymoron. But they are unlikely to go into a general election campaigning for even a rejoin of single market and customs union. They have let go of that. So I don't see, at a UK Westminster level, I don't see any movement big enough to enact that change at the next election. Obviously, you would hope that further down the line that might change. And it was also made clear in discussions that the smaller EEA group would not necessarily welcome the UK as a big Eurosceptic, maybe coming into the playpen and trying to boss everybody else around. So, you know, the idea that all of those options are on the table, I don't think they are for the UK as a whole at the moment. I think that's a longer term job to do. Scotland, I think, would be welcome, but not if we treat them as just a temporary measure. Obviously, this kind of halfway house was very much put forward as, well, this is a way of pleasing the fishermen and the farmers who supported Brexit. Now, while the majority of fishermen supported Brexit, actually the majority of farmers voted Remain, something which is often overlooked. And as a fishing constituency myself, I would say there's been a marked change among fishermen. They have not had the quota that they were promised. It has not been the windfall. The issues at the border of getting very fresh produce out. In my constituency, it's lobster and langoustine. They now are earning about half what they used to because they just cannot get it to Paris as quickly now as they used to. And I would always point out that you don't hear of Spanish fishermen trying to leave the common fisheries policy. And that's because their governments have gone into bat every year to get quota for their fishermen. Westminster has never cared a tuppenny toss about fishing. And with 60% of the UK fishing industry, I would expect that to be quite different. If a Scottish government was going into bat, Scotland would be one of the big fishery nations within the EU, and I think would have a stronger voice and actually a stronger interest in getting a good result. So to me, the idea that EEA, which is single market but not customs union, is the answer. You're going to have a border basically to the rest of the UK because you're in the single market, and you're still going to have a border to the rest of the EU. And I think when you'd be trying to sell that, that would actually just look like a negative. People know what the EU is. They know what they've lost. They didn't know it in advance, but as they say, you only know what you've got when it's gone. I think that that is still what we need to commit to. And in the same way as EEA members do not want us to see them as temporary, EU members do not want Scotland to treat them as if it's something we're half-hearted about. They will not want a mini UK who's coming in and moaning about everything. So I think for an independent Scotland, accession takes time. An associate agreement would be something that might well be available earlier, as Peter said, and we should be doing that negotiation at the same time as leaving the UK so that any gap is kept as short as possible. But they will be expecting us to be genuinely committed EU members. And Scotland, I would suggest, wants to be at the top table. We want to have influence. We want to play our part. And I think that is quite important to our vision of us as an active member in the EU. There are, of course, things that Peter mentioned that have to be dealt with. And the one that is thrown up all the time is the Scottish-English border. And I can tell you, as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, the two borders are not alike in any fashion at all. Borders are normal. Out with Schengen, between every country and every other country in the world is a border. And these are managed, some of them by light touch, by a lot of technology. Some of them obviously are impenetrable. But the thing is, we will be part of the common travel area. If there is any suggestion that the rest of the UK or the UK government would refuse that, that would look so utterly like spitefulness. I think that would backfire on them. And I certainly do not see the EU objecting to us being members of the common travel area in the way that Ireland is. The Irish border is 3 times the length of the Scottish border. It has 10 times the number of crossings as the Scottish-English one. And the basic thing is, if we are in the common travel area, you are talking about a border for goods. You are not talking about a border for people. We have one major motorway. You have to come up with how you will manage that border. But in actual fact, It is not something where you can't use technology. In Ireland, if you try to use smart gates, number plate recognition cameras, or anything else, you are actually laying out, unfortunately, a target for attack. And that is not something that would be a problem on the Scottish-English border. So it's thrown up as a major issue, but in actual fact, what we need to be doing is laying out how we will manage it. It will be an external EU border, but the way we should look upon it and describe it is basically the UK government have surrounded England and Wales with a barbed wire fence. We're choosing to step outside that. And actually, instead of having 30 borders to the east and west of us, we will only have one border to the south. And I would see that as a plus, not a negative.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippa, for that remarkably detailed and interesting exposition of your position, of the SNP position. Finally, before we move on to a more general discussion, can we hear from David with his considerable experience in European affairs and indeed in advising accession countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm joining this discussion with a degree of trepidation because, unlike the previous speakers, I'm not a Scot. I'm not going to express a view about Scottish affairs because I'm not qualified to do so. I'm going to talk about this issue from the point of view of the United Kingdom, and I envisage that I'm going to continue living in the United Kingdom and putting up with the situation as it is. So I want to make things better for people south of the border. And I'm going to nail my colours to the mast straight away and say that I align with those who think that the UK should settle for nothing less than full membership. I'm not in favour of the halfway house. I'd like to just step back a bit and think about how we got to where we are. If you cast your minds back to 2016 and the referendum, David Cameron said that this was going to be an in-out referendum, a binary choice. But in fact, we find out that it's really a four-way choice. There were three versions of leave. There was leave with a deal, leave without a deal, and thirdly, be like Norway or Switzerland, which was actually quite heavily promoted in the referendum by people like Nigel Farage and Daniel Hannan and others. And leave won the referendum partly because it succeeded in fudging the difference between these different varieties of being out. And after Cameron resigned, Theresa May continued to fudge. She said Brexit means Brexit, but she didn't define what it was. And while her red lines pointed to a full exit, the Irish backstop enabled her to stay in the single market by default. So it was a bit of a trick. We all know what happened after that, and Boris Johnson seized his opportunity. So where are we now? As others have pointed out before me, there's a growing consensus that Brexit isn't working, except perhaps ironically in Northern Ireland, where it does seem to be, things seem to be rather better. The bad effects of Brexit have been masked by COVID, but next year they're going to become more apparent as we start to levy duties on EU imports. So there's quite a lot of buyer's remorse around, not just in the fishing community, but I think among small businesses and farmers as well. And in this situation, the two big political parties are saying, well, let's renegotiate. The Conservatives are trying to renegotiate the situation in Ireland to appease the hardline unionists, but they've mismanaged these negotiations by continually threatening dire consequences if they don't get what they want and then caving in. So I don't think they're really going to make any progress. And on the Labour side, well, the Labour Party is to some extent still dysfunctional, although the new front bench looks stronger than the old one. And Starmer told the CBI on the 22nd of November that he wanted mutual recognition with the EU, mutual recognition of standards. And that's a very old story, an approach that's been tried before. And I don't think it will fly, because essentially it's cakeism. It's asking the EU to let us have our standards, but to escape from EU jurisdiction. I'm not certain whether this is going to be the Labour Party's last word. I think it's probably designed to protect their rather fragile party unity and its electioneering in the run-up to various by-elections, and perhaps it will stay until a general election, who knows, but I think it may begin to move. So then the third way, is the third way negotiable? Well, we've heard a lot about that already, and I don't want to really try to second guess Peter Sellar, who's a great expert, and I'm not. But I think that some parts of the third way are, accepting EU social and environmental rules, accepting ECJ jurisdiction, accepting free movement, probably a budget contribution too. So it's fundamentally against Brexit ideology, and it's not going to fly with the leavers. And both leavers and rejoiners would point to the fact that we will be a rule taker. We won't have a seat in the EU institutions, so it won't suit either side. And from my point of view, it would be very undesirable to go into something that we might get stuck in. Rien ne dure comme le provisoire. For me, the problem of the third way is really that we won't be in the room when great decisions affecting our continent are taken, and that's just not acceptable. It's not just about trade, it's mainly about geopolitics. The international situation is currently very fragile. China and Russia both have unfulfilled territorial ambitions. They think that the West is weak because of COVID-19 and because the United States are preoccupied with internal problems. Russia actually supported Brexit. One detects the hand of Russia in several things that happened during and immediately after the referendum. So I think we need a seat at the table when Europe's policies are being discussed. We need friends in a dangerous world, and we can't simply rely on the United States. Trump is still around and wants to come back. He promoted Brexit, and he seemed to want to abolish NATO. So I feel that a lot is going to depend on the new German government and how they manage to get their act together. I hope that they will be able to work towards the EU becoming stronger, and I don't believe those who say it's going to collapse. Not sure how much longer I've got, but I'm just going to say what I think about a full rejoin and what's stopping it. Well, some say that the EU won't want us back, and my answer to that is that they've not said so, and they haven't been asked. So we won't know until we ask them, and we won't ask them until we've got rid of the present government. If the present government collapses and a new one comes to power, then we'll be in a new situation. And if that new government posed the question, I believe that the EU would listen very carefully. Now, some say that rejoining will mean we have to accept all the conditions of a full member, like a full budget contribution, Schengen, single currency. We wouldn't have any more opt-outs. Now, again, the EU haven't pronounced on this, or at least not that I know of in public, and it would depend on the results of a negotiation that we are yet to have. We won't know what's possible until we try. Personally, I don't mind getting rid of the opt-outs, but I accept that I will be in a minority on that. So the first essential step is to get rid of the government. there's a big obstacle to that because at the moment we don't have the votes, but there is an opportunity for a coalition approach. And I just want to say in this forum that England can't be saved without Scotland's help. If there's going to be a coalition after a general election, then Scottish MPs would have to be in that coalition. And I believe that it would be in their interests to do so, because two things are not in Scotland's national interest: a dysfunctional England or a hard border. Because although I agree with Philippa that there would be free movement of people across the border, there wouldn't be free movement of goods. And just as a side note, I was in Prague on the morning when the Commission told the Czechs that if they joined the EU and Slovakia didn't join the EU, there would be a hard border in the middle of what used to be one country. So I think that's something to reflect on. How much longer do I have?
You can carry on if there are things you would like to say, or we can move to discussion if you prefer.
I can I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a possibility of going back to the status quo ante. If we were able to legally declare the 2016 decision null and void, then everything that's happened since is potentially invalid. We would never legally have left. So our opt-outs would notionally still be in place. And if you look at who took the decision to leave and the circumstances in which it was taken, you will remember that there was a judgment of the Supreme Court that compelled Mrs. May to ask Parliament's permission to deliver her Article 50 letter. So it looks as if she was relying on the royal prerogative, and that should only apply, strictly speaking, in foreign affairs, and should never have been used in a situation that involved huge implications for domestic policy. So to conclude, a trick was played on us in 2016 that has left us with the worst government in living memory. Things will get even worse next year. The UK needs to get back into the EU sooner rather than later. And as the Brexit mess gets worse next year, public opinion will begin to swing behind this. So I'd like to see a broad-based coalition go into the next election with the aim of opening negotiations with the EU. And it shouldn't tie its hand now as to what the negotiation should achieve. It should be ambitious, and it should shoot for the best outcome in the national interest, which I believe will be a return to full membership. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and for very helpfully broadening out the context and giving us the perspective on the UK and single market customs union future. I'm getting the sense from the panel that you all see the EA as really not your preference, or single market customs union option as not a preference. And just to play devil's advocate for a moment, I wonder if we're dismissing that option perhaps too easily. If we look at the UK as their situation in relation to the EU, is it not the case that it might actually be more sellable to the British electorate as a whole, especially the English electorate, to say that we were not going to join the EU and there wasn't going to be any ever closer union, but that we would be going back to a more sort of economic-based approach, which was what many people thought we had joined initially, and therefore, in that sense, is it more realistic as an option? Do we know definitely, if we are talking about Scotland's future, that the EEA members would be opposed to us considering it as a transitional measure? would they not simply regard it as a quite a sensible thing to do for a period?
It is a thing, Vanessa, that they have expressed. I mean, obviously, as part of our outreach here, colleagues, you know, through the all-party parliamentary groups, through meetings with embassies, through meetings with other stakeholders, particularly from Nordic countries, which obviously includes 2 of the EEA, EFTA countries, they have verbalized that.
Right.
That they do not wish to be seen as a temporary staging post. For them to positively welcome Scotland into their group, they would be wanting us to see that as our choice, our destination. And I think you can understand that. It seems a little bit disrespectful in a way to go through that process with the, but we're only on your team till we can get to the bigger team. But they have come up with that. They have verbalized that.
Well, it's interesting to hear that is what they have said, rather than that we have suggested that might be their position. And you also made the point that it might seem a bit half-hearted to the EU if we went down the EEA route.
I've certainly had that from a couple of former ambassadors that I've done, you know, that I've had meetings with, that they have very much been saying, you know, with their experience. I mean, Europe is still very bruised from Brexit and still quite shocked. And people on the ground, my husband's German, so we watch the German media. I talk to my German family. They are still kind of in a little bit of a state of disbelief of it all. And they simply don't want someone else who's just half-hearted and always asking for opt-outs and special arrangements, and you know, we're not really interested in the project. We just want a bit of single market and a bit easier borders. They are looking for a country that would believe in the European project.
And Vanessa, if I may also add in sort of the practical, the idea that we go to the EEA as a stepping stone or a staging post and then on to the EU, from a practical real life perspective, means that you've put the European Union through 2 separate negotiating processes. So there's a negotiation process separate, goes through a separate article under the treaty, and they have to put it through all their civil servants, and it takes up all their time, their effort, costs money. And then we turn around after a few years and say, can we now go through the whole EU candidacy process? And they're going to turn around. I mean, I haven't heard it, but I have certainly read it, that it is a destination. The EEA has been viewed as your destination, and that's it. And that chapter is closed, and we'll see you later. But we'll talk to you just as being a member of the EEA or part of the EEA. If we want to go to the EU, we go to the EU directly. If we want to be a member state of the EU.
Well, I'm just switching back to Philippa quickly. Would the Scottish Government, do you imagine, wish to hold a referendum offering the people of Scotland a choice after a successful independence referendum? Would they put it to a vote, or would they simply regard it as a given that an elected Scottish Government would proceed with a
I don't think that's yet clear, Vanessa. And obviously, you know, we saw how people were so easily misled on Brexit. These things are quite difficult and quite complex, and you very quickly get into just, you know, 3-word slogans, and you know, you can end up kind of in a mess. So, you know, it might be that the whatever the Scottish Government would be at that time feels that actually, when you look at it in its totality, EU is so much better a deal than EEA, and the support for EU at 62% in the referendum is enough. Or they may feel, well, okay, there is some degree of choice here. We will let the people be involved in that. But you'd have to be very clear that you could explain, as Peter has been talking about, the pros and cons of what it is you're offering. I mean, for me personally, you know, my husband's German, as I said, you know, freedom of movement was one of our biggest gains as individuals, one of our biggest losses, but it's also all the agencies. I see it, I'm on the UK Trade and Business Commission that was set up when the government shut the Future Relationship EU Select Committee down just 2 weeks after the trade deal. And we are going through sector by sector. And while some of them, it is just a matter of paperwork at the border, or can we be in the customs union, in actual fact, it's much more complicated than that. And businesses, academics, research institutions, and individuals are impacted in so many different ways. And so even if you look at the economy of the whole UK and how much it's a service-based economy, and that's not just the City of London, it's other, it's architects, it's accountants, it's, as we heard, creatives, opera societies, and fashion models and musicians. In actual fact, EEA won't solve absolutely all of that. And therefore, to try to help people to pick out, here's the EU, or here's something less, I think would be a very complicated referendum to run, and you would have to be very certain that you were going to be able to explain it in a clear and intelligible manner. So there's not been any policy on that I'm aware of. And I think that's a decision that would be made after independence. But I think that it's clear the people of Scotland want to be in a very strong relationship with the EU, whether that's fully in, which would be, it sounds like our majority choice on this panel, or whether they would take what would be a risk of having a referendum and people thinking, oh yeah, EEA does almost as much, which is frankly a little bit of a public narrative. And my impression is, that I've tried to touch on this evening, is that just isn't true. It's not necessarily easier, cheaper, or solving all the problems that we now have of Brexit.
And Philippa, what do you make of David's plea that they would be looking, England would be looking to Scotland to support a coalition, or at least some kind of alliance, in order to create a government in the UK that could get the UK as a whole, as a first step at least, back towards a closer relationship with the EU? Is that something the SNP could be open?
Well, I'm sorry, the SNP have offered at the last two general elections that we would be happy to work with Labour to create a progressive alliance, or whatever you want to call it. That was thrown out of hand by Labour. So this is not something that the SNP can do. And I'm sorry, if we look on this as a dysfunctional marriage, the idea that the kind of wife who's putting up with coercive control should just stay at home and try to reform her husband, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. And it's certainly not something that after the next general election, the SNP would support, that we give up on our own self-determination because we're going to try to reform what people want here. If you look back at that map the morning after the Brexit vote with Scotland yellow and England blue, it's England that has to change its mind. And Scotland, with 8.4% of the UK population, cannot do it. Us down here with going forward 57 out of 650 MPs cannot do it. So the people within England and Wales, which is obviously where David's from, who want to change the relationship with Europe, you have to change the minds of the people in England and Wales. And I'm afraid we tried that. I've been here 6.5 years, and I mean, it's like trying to chisel a diamond. You're not breaking through. So I think for Scotland, we don't dislike people in England and Wales. We just want to be neighbours. We don't want to be bossed around anymore. And the idea we would give up that chance of self-determination to try to change minds down here, it isn't going to happen. And as I say, has already been rejected out of hand by the Labour Party again more recently.
That's very clear.
Vanessa, just one other way of looking at it is, instead of looking at it as being the UK rejoining, you could, it probably would be easier if Scotland were to rejoin. Scotland becomes a member state of the EU. because that has the benefit for England of having, frankly, a very close ally, someone who understands England very well within the European Union. And in due course, if England eventually comes around to the idea that being part of not just that huge consumer market, but part of that geopolitically incredibly important lump of earth in this world, in due course, maybe they will see the light, so to speak, but they'll have an automatic ally. There's a positive, in other words, in letting Scotland go before the rest of the UK, with the UK coming in after.
And I think, Peter, just following on from that, if the UK was in Europe, of course, in actual fact, we would, as neighbours, be campaigning for England and Wales to rejoin if there was any sea change in the population here, because, of course, it absolutely would make our lives easier in the future. But when people throw up the idea of the border and the problem and trade, and you trade more with the rest of the UK, you need to look at the data from the Republic of Ireland. When they became independent, their trade was 90% plus to GB. When they joined Europe, it was over 55%. It's now just dipped below 10% for the first time. So going out into the wider world changes the trade routes and the trade opportunities of countries. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, a Scotland in Europe would be campaigning to invite England and Wales back. If we reach a point where people in England and Wales have changed their minds, we can't drag them.
No, and that's the point I'd like to turn to David on. David, what will it take, do you think, for England to change its mind? We see really quite reinforced English nationalism, a really authoritarian streak in the government that panders to that nationalist approach. Do you see that changing enough for the return to the EU that you would like?
Well, I think it's obviously an uphill battle, Vanessa, and you know, one doesn't want to see the UK suffering severe economic damage, but I'm fearful that that's what may start to happen next year. I think that minds will start to shift if that does happen. And if by some miracle there is not a Conservative majority in the next Parliament, and I very much hope that there won't be, or if the Conservative Party were to split, if another leader were to come in with, shall we say, a more balanced approach. I mean, one doesn't know who they would elect if they decided to ditch their present leader. But, you know, you could imagine a situation where the case could start to be made that our best course would be to rejoin the EU. But I think the battle that one would then have to fight with, I mean, there would still be lots of Brexit around, as it were, lots of nationalists battling on these issues, and the issues we would have to fight them on would be the same for rejoining the customs union and the single market as they would be for the EU. So, you know, might as well be hanged for a sheep as for a goat. You know, we might as well go the whole hog. We have nothing to lose.
Indeed. I think it's time to turn to our audience and take some questions covering issues that we haven't had chance to look at yet. David, can you put those to the panel, please?
I'll unmute myself.
Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah. Yes. Well, there's a lot of questions basically. I mean, one of the questions is, and this relates to what we've just been talking about, which is that David was addressing, and Kirsty Hughes, our friend, has been also talking about, is the case of the UK. How long does the panel think it would take for the EU to accept the UK rejoining? 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, or frankly, never?
I'm happy to chip in with 30, and I say that because that was the timing given to me when I worked in the European Court of Justice. So at the 2018 to 19, I was there. and had certain conversations with certain people. And the reason 30 was thrown out as a number was that there's going to be a lot of burned bridges, and we were putting the EU through a lot of hassle, and it has been hassle for 5 years, that it won't be forgotten. So once we're out, and you don't expect to be back in for a proper full generation plus. And there's echoes of, I mentioned that we helped set up EFTA back in the late 50s and early 60s. We left it. We left it to join the EEC, which became the EU, and we've left it. We are not the most trustable allies in these things. So if we were to come back in, and picking up a point that David was making, we're going to come back in and we are going to be told, that's it. This is the membership criteria. These are the membership criteria. You will accept them. And I cannot see, well, maybe in 30 years, 30 years is a long time, things may change, who knows? But at current trajectory, I think we will not be welcomed back as the UK for a good while to come.
I think there's two sides to it, Vanessa. I think one is whether we'd be welcome back, and I would agree with Peter. I don't see it being within 10 years when you think that there'll be a general election, whether it's 23 or 24, which will already take us pretty much to the end of this decade, and particularly if it is a second Conservative government. And I know it looks like this week and last week they're on their way out and all the rest of it, but the resilience of the Tory vote in polls, despite one crisis after another over recent years, is, to me, is as much an argument for independence as anything else. So I think you're certainly looking whether 20 or 30, but part of it is when the EU would have reached a point of forgiving us and welcoming the UK back in. But in actual fact, you need the demographic change to reach a point where the majority of people in England, Wales are not just grudgingly 51% would go back into the EU because it solves a problem. You're actually requiring what you see among younger people, which is 75% plus actually seeing themselves as Europeans, really distress at the loss of their EU citizenship, and therefore wanting to be active members. So I think that takes time on the UK side as well as time on the EU side. But I do also agree that it would be, okay, you're in here on your best behavior. It's not going to be, we are the UK and we demand X, Y, and Z to join. It's not going to be that. The EU is not going to be coming to the UK groveling for a return. It would be the other way around. So you need a big change here and you need a lot of healing there. And I would say the key word in Peter's comments was trust. The issues going on with the Northern Ireland Protocol at the moment means that trust in the UK government is absolutely rock bottom, absolutely rock bottom. And looking at the likes of German media, who have always been, if you like, allies of the UK within the EU, it's quite shocking to see what the view of us at the moment is. So I think there's a long way to go on both sides of the channel.
Well, I agree with Philippa that trust in this government is at rock bottom. I don't trust them either. But we're predicating this on a situation where this government is gone and we've got a better one. And then it's going to be, I think, highly political. I mean, if you look at the situation after General de Gaulle said, no, you can't join the common market as it was then. And what happened, de Gaulle went, a new French government comes in, Edward Heath becomes Prime Minister. Suddenly there is a rapport across the channel that didn't exist before, and something became possible and they started to talk. And if you get that kind of momentum going, something could happen pretty quickly. But it all depends on not having Boris Johnson or a Johnson clone in power in London. And so that the debate is not, will the EU have us back? Yes, they will, if we get rid of this government and get our minds around what we have to do to get back in.
The problem, though, David, is you would also require that the replacement government, led by Labour of whatever proportion, has to actually believe in doing that. And of course, that's not where they are at the moment. So you actually need as big a change within Labour as you need within the Conservative Party.
I think it's true that Labour have to change. They have changed in the sense that Corbyn is no longer their leader, but they need to change more. And I think it's almost inevitable, isn't it? If they do, if there isn't a Conservative majority, there will have to be some kind of coalition to form a government. The Lib Dems are further towards EU membership, perhaps, than the Labour Party are. If the SNP are still in the Westminster Parliament, which I suppose they might be, they will be at least neutral in this question. I mean, I assume you would not want to support a Conservative minority government. No. So, I mean, it's really a no-brainer for you that you would want something better than that.
As I say, David, our party leader has offered in 2017 and 2019 that we would support, and indeed in 2015, that we would support a progressive alliance. And you'll remember the adverts of Alex Salmond with Ed Miliband, and then later Nicola Sturgeon with Labour in the pocket. I find it quite bizarre. If people in England want Scotland to stay in the Union, why do you so utterly object to Scottish MPs having any influence on a UK government? It just highlights the democratic deficit. But our party has offered repeatedly to work in whatever arrangement, and it has been turned down.
That's very reassuring. But I mean, the exam question was, how long will it take to get back in the EU? And I think that's the wrong question. The right question is, how long will it take to get a different government in Westminster? And if we have the right government in Westminster, I think the EU might respond quite quickly in the way that it responded to Spain after Franco went, for example.
But David, you would also have to change people's minds, because you couldn't reverse Brexit without having another referendum at some point. So it isn't just a matter of changing government. You actually would have to change the view of Europe in England and Wales from anti-European to actively and warmly pro-European. And I agree with Peter. I think that's going to take quite a while.
I think the British public is going to have had no end of a lesson by the time all this is over about the difference between being in the EU and being out of it. And we're having that lesson now as we speak, and it is going to get worse.
So is the panel saying, basically, the three of you saying that, well, you can almost like put the prospects of the EU, of the UK rejoining to one side for at least another decade, if not longer, and actually, whereas in actual fact, the prospect of Scotland rejoining is much more live. And what is although we're miles away, let's be honest, even Philippa might have to agree with this, away from the independence question, despite the so-called plans for a referendum in 2023 at the latest. And what will the implications be for people asking, like George Chiesa, what will the implications of that be for the border between England and Scotland and for freedom of movement in particular?
Well, I think I touched on that earlier. There is absolutely no defence for a UK government trying to say Scotland would be excluded from the common travel area. Ireland gained its independence through bloodshed and civil war a century ago. The idea that Scotland, that was told we love you just 7 years ago and has had a totally peaceful campaign for self-determination, would somehow be kicked out of the common travel area would be both bizarre and spiteful. So I just don't see that flying. And if they were trying to use it as a campaign tool in an independence referendum, I think it would just backfire on them utterly. And I certainly, if you look at the various kind of travel areas in Scandinavia, in you know, the British Islands and so on. Europe puts up with a lot of flexibility, and the common travel area is long established. So I don't see that being an issue. So there isn't an issue for freedom of movement. You are not interfering with people. And of course, it all gets easier if eventually you end up with a united Ireland, which, you know, being from Northern Ireland, I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime, but now I think I might see in my lifetime. But the border would be for goods. We only have 2 main crossings. It's nothing like the Irish border. So you're talking about building something like the M6 toll, where lorries have to come off and, you know, get their goods checked. There'll be smart gates. You can use all the technology that Lars Clarkson talks about, but you're pulling off for that. People are just driving up to see Granny just go through, and you're only going to stop cars on the basis of things like intelligence. And you can use number plate recognition. You can use other technology on a Scottish border that you simply cannot use on an Irish border. So always starting from, oh, it'll be like the Irish border. No, the Irish border is very unique. It's among a handful in the world where the border specifically and border infrastructure is something that could bring people back to blowing each other up. That is not normal anywhere else. There are borders. Ours would be closest to that between Norway and Sweden, I would suggest. So you would look at other borders, you look at the Swiss border, you look at the technology that's available, you look at the digital support for the paperwork around it, but it's nothing like the Irish border, and we shouldn't allow that kind of parallel, because the Irish border is a very, very specific case.
Perhaps a better parallel would be the border between Switzerland and France. Switzerland's not in the EU, but it has free movement. It's in the Schengen area, but it has a border for goods. So there's a customs checks. There are also customs checks on individuals when they cross the border, if they're thought to be bringing too much, I don't know, fresh meat or wine or whatever in the boot of their car. They can run into trouble, and Swiss customs officials are notorious. So, I mean, I agree with you that there will be free movement of people, but I guess there wouldn't be free movement of goods. And I don't think that technology would be enough to, you know, the magic eye that does it all remotely. That's not going to happen. There will have to be boots on the ground actually controlling trucks.
And I think we have to accept that. But because we have a border that actually only has 29 crossings in a relatively thinly populated part of northern England and southern Scotland, it's not like the Irish border that runs down the road and through people's houses and farms and things. So, you know, you need to design it, but you have to accept that it will exist. It would be naive to suggest it won't. But Norway is in Schengen as well, so that, you know, you've also got the model there as well as Switzerland. Yeah. So there's lots of other models to follow.
What I'm saying is it would be a lot better if it didn't have to exist, because the whole UK would rejoin together. That would be my ambition.
I don't see it happening together. I'm with Peter on that, but I would agree with Peter's point that Scotland would then be an advocate for England and Wales rejoining, because it takes even that infrastructure, or the need for that infrastructure, away. But I'm afraid I don't think we're going to wait the 20 or 30 years for you to change people's minds down here.
I'm hoping it's going to be a lot quicker than that.
Well, indeed. Can I just interject there and ask, because Ewan Kennedy's asked this as a kind of cri de coeur in the Q&A. He says that if we were to go straight to EU membership, and I presume he's talking about, well, Scotland and or the UK, it would take some years. You know, in the Scottish case, it would certainly take, many of us that would think it would take up to maybe at least 8 to 10 years from now, assuming independence. So what are the chances of getting any kind of amelioration of problems in the meantime?
I'll come in on that if I may. I think that might be a reference to the arrangements that Philip and I have referred to, the association agreement or a pre-accession agreement.
Yeah.
So, and you've got to almost break it down in terms of timing. If you vote, I'm looking at it from the Scottish point of view, if you vote successfully for independence, then there will be a negotiation period over which one works out how Scotland actually becomes an independent state and the rest of the UK becomes the successor state. That can run parallel, I think Philippa mentioned this, with perhaps the idea that we then also negotiate or put in our application for to be a candidate country, but but that doesn't happen from a Friday to a Monday. There's a lot of preparation that needs to go in before you send off that formal application, and however long that will take, I don't know. We can only guesstimate. We're not talking 5 or 10 years for that. We are talking, on the other hand, maybe a couple of years. But once we get out of that couple of years process and you put in your application, then you can, it really depends how prepared and how quickly we want to be prepared to open the chapters, the acquis communautaire chapters, and close them. I've been told that certain chapters would be open and closed in 2 seconds. And chapter 17, the economic chapter, opened and closed on the same day. I've been told by that, and I was quite surprised to hear, but there are reasons for it behind that. But in the meantime, regardless of how quickly chapters are opened for negotiation and then closed, there would be normally a pre-accession agreement. And that association agreement, as I mentioned, is asymmetric. It's to the benefit of the candidate country. And alongside that, there are other mechanisms whereby you get money to support you for certain things that you're trying to do, such as institution building. So when Iceland was in the process quite a few years ago of thinking about becoming a member state of the EU, they got money. They actually received money to help them in that process. Of course, they went in a different direction after that. But in that period, however long it takes, and when you talk about 8 or 10 years, you have to say from what points? From the date of the application when it is sent in. And of course, that assumes there's a few years before that of preparation. There will be, and there ought to be, because it's not controversial and it's normal, an agreement which is beneficial in terms of trade terms and in terms of free movement terms between Scotland, the candidate country, and the EU. So for that period that we're outside, we do have a nice, it's a safety net of sorts.
I think, Peter, lots of people don't realize that it is a gradual process. So, and I think that's where the narrative comes, oh, let's just do EFTA on its own, which to me doesn't solve any of the problems because it's neither single market nor customs union, or what they kind of mean is EEA. We'll get into that quicker. And I think people don't realize that if there are parts of the acquis that you already meet, or different aspects of the single market and the EU you already meet, some of those you get to align with quite quickly. And as you say, you get help to work towards some of the others. And maybe that's something that needs more discussion for people to realize that actually, yes, being your final, yes, that's you fully in the EU can take quite a long time. But some of those early steps where we are a human rights-based democracy, we have the rule of law, we have a parliament, etc., you know, they're already going, yeah, tick, tick, tick. So you start to get onto that pathway.
Can I just for a point of interest, you just mentioned the Copenhagen criteria there, which were developed in order to assist and in order to make it clear what countries from the Balkans and from ex-communist states had to do. And of course, rule of law, democracy, etc. People might not know, but the previous criteria were what I call the Edinburgh criteria, because they were formulated at the Edinburgh Summit of '92, which were basically tailored for the likes of Finland and Austria. And of course, you didn't have any reference to the rule of law and democracy. And those are more for us, for Scotland. So you will have chapters which are just open and closed on the same day. But let's not underplay that it will be difficult, and go back to another point I make. The more that we diverge in terms of our, whatever it may be, but I do chemicals, also chemicals regulations, the more difficult it will be to close that chapter quickly.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. We must, I'm afraid, draw to a close. You've been a terrific panel and it's been a really great discussion. I just want to thank Peter, Philippa and David for their excellent contributions today and for so generously sharing your time and expertise. Thank you too to our participants in the audience and for your questions. If people would like to be involved more in the issues that we are discussing today, please do follow EMiS on social media and do consider joining the movement in order that we can all work our way back to the EU together. Our most upcoming next event is another webinar in January, and that will be on the rule of law, which Peter just mentioned now. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a very good evening. Thank you.
And a safe and happy Christmas. Bye.
And to you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.